had the honor to hear Sandra Sawchuk's phenomenal presentation on Ukrainian settlement in Western provinces at the post-1991 migration conference over at the University of Alberta. And I am so pleased that Sandra has agreed to share her findings and her analysis with our audience here today as well. So Sandra Sawchuk is the Research Data and Assessment Librarian at Mount St. Vincent University Library and Archives in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Her research interests include digital humanities and data rescue and reuse. Her recent publications are focused on computational reproducibility and secondary data use. She's currently participating in a 2-year SSHRC partnership grant to improve access to Canada's historic census. So Sandra, thank you so much for joining us here today, and the digital floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Julia, and it's such a pleasure to be here to speak with all of you today about my research. I'm presenting on the research that I was discussing at the conference at the U of A last spring. And I'm very excited to say that I'm going on sabbatical on January 1st, and my entire program of research during my sabbatical will be extending the time period of this research to encompass a lot of historical census information. As Yulia mentioned, I am working on a SSHRC grant with a number of other data librarians across the country to increase access to Canada's historic census. So we're in the final phases of the grant, and the next grant will be creating a portal for researchers to find census data going back to 1655. So there is so much census data out there, it's very exciting. And I today am only talking about a very small period in relation to the whole period of census data that we have available to us. But that is the, the direction from which my research comes is, looking at the historic census and contemporary census data. The most recent census that we had in Canada was the 2021 census, and data are still being released from this census. So there are pieces of the 2021 data set that I would love to see, but those data have not yet been released from StatsCan. So I'm really eagerly anticipating the continued data releases from them on what I will be speaking about today, which is the ethnic origin variable. I'm going to share my screen right now, and then we will begin the presentation. So bear with me for a moment while I grab this presentation. I'm just going to share my entire desktop just in case I need to link to anything extra. And you should be seeing now a presentation on your screen right now. Yulia, can you just give me a thumbs up that you're seeing my, yes, great. So give me one more second to move around some of the Zoom accoutrements of Zoom so I can see what I'm looking at. Okay, so this research is the first piece, as I said, in my sabbatical research, and I, for the conference that occurred in Edmonton, looked at 30 years of census data going back to 1991. As you can see, there is a historic photo, and this photo is of my father, baby father, grandmother, and great-grandmother on their homestead in Two Hills, Alberta, which is where my family settled. And I always like, as a researcher, bringing a personal touch into the research that I do, because we cannot escape our, our past and our histories, and it affects everything that we do as a researcher. So I like to put that front and center. At the end of this presentation, I will also share the link to this presentation because you can view it yourself online. This is a publicly available presentation. There are a lot of links and stuff like that in it. So what I'm going to talk about today is this historic settlement of Ukrainians in the prairie provinces. Ukrainians have settled all across Canada, but and I apologize for my cat is very interested in this presentation as well. If you hear her meowing in the background, I'm sorry. Ukrainians have been settling in the prairie provinces since the late 1800s, and it followed a really neat program that was established by the government at the time called block settlement. So block settlement was a way for the government of Canada to place immigrants in blocks of their countrymen. So there were a number of settlements in the prairie provinces that were comprised completely of Ukrainians. And this model was really attractive to the government and to the settlers because it was very easy for government land agents to kind of keep track of where people were and keep track of what was going on, and also keep track of cultural communities. As we know, during the First World War, there was a lot of internment of Ukrainian Canadians. My great-grandfather in Two Hills, thankfully, was not interned, but they took his horses and made him walk to Edmonton every month. So the block settlement was a way for land agents to kind of know where people were and not have to go all over the place. But it worked really, really well for immigrants, specifically Ukrainian immigrants, because they were able to form communities. And they were able to work together and cooperate together. Now, the problem with this, in the government's eyes, quickly became that they felt that Ukrainians specifically were not integrating in the way that they wanted. So when as time went on, and as more immigrants came, the government officials began to think that this was not something that they wanted to continue. In fact, Frank Oliver, who is, a really notorious in Edmonton for being quite anti-Indigenous, was also quite anti-Ukrainian. So you can see from this quote here that he was really worried that this block settlement and this concentration would really lower the standards. And this is one of the more benign quotes that I've seen coming from government officials on the settlement of Ukrainians. I'm so sorry about my cat. So despite this, though, Ukrainians continue to settle where they wanted to settle in this block pattern because it really, really worked for them and it worked for their sense of community. You can see here a timeline. I'm just going to pick up this little demon so that she can be in the presentation like she wants. You can see in the timeline here that the settlement began in the late 1800s. Once folks began to come, this settlement increased. And, by 1906, this arc pattern of which I'm going to speak about today was really, really fully established. We have here a map showing in Alberta the first settlement of Ukrainian immigrants in Star, Manitoba. And then we can see, by 1906, that these settlements following the Parkland region became very, very well established. And I was so thrilled to gain some insight at the conference in Edmonton about this arch, this Parkland region. Being the reason why this arch occurs is because there were so many trees in that parkland belt. So the Ukrainian settlers were very invested in having access to timber and to wood. So they settled in areas in which they were able to use the forest and use that for their settlements. And you can see a number of different settlements that you might be familiar with in the index there. Now, the cool thing, and this is where, the data librarian in me thinks this is really neat, is the way the settlement occurred actually was in block shape, square block shape. So when we talk about block migration, we're talking about a block of people settling, but we're actually also talking about a square piece of land where the settlement occurred. And this is because of the Dominion Land Survey. So before large scale immigration occurred in Canada, with the acquisition of Rupert's Land in the West, the government of Canada decided that they really needed to know what they had purchased. So they sent a whole bunch of land surveyors out into the West to map and really account for every block of land. Now, I would be remiss to mention that this purchase occurred despite the land already being occupied by Indigenous peoples. So, in effect, the Indigenous, occupants at the time were also sold. So I can't speak about this history without recognizing the fact that, the selling of land is not really, without controversy. Now, this survey work began in 1871, and it really encompassed 1.4 billion acres, which included the three prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, as well as parts of the north. So here is a illustration of the west side of Lake Winnipeg. So you can see Lake Winnipeg is on the far right of the image. And this is an illustration of the Dominion Land Survey blocks along with the Ukrainian settlement that existed in those blocks. So it really was a very orderly grid-like system. And this grid allows us to very easily locate where settlers began and where they moved using census data, which I will show you in a moment. So you can see here some information about how that block works. And I'm just going to show you another map here that shows all three of the prairie provinces. So you can see that there were meridian lines running north to south, and there's a code that is used to identify each of these blocks based at first on these meridian lines. So the provinces were split in this very systematic way in order to facilitate the mapping project. So it's very, very interesting. And it allows us to really understand the richness of the census data that were collected at that time. Now, this image has symbology that is showing the regions from which the Ukrainian settlers came. So it's really interesting to note that the block settlement also was based on regional location of Ukrainian settlers. So people that were from specific regions often, and it makes sense, would settle together. Now, in this image, these gray squares in the middle, those gray squares were owned by the Hudson's Bay, and they were reserved for things like train stations and schools and other more government types of buildings. But if you are interested at all in these legal land descriptions, and if you are researching in the census, these can very easily be translated to, latitude and longitude coordinates. Now, in this map, 1 square mile, so one single square, is 640 acres. And then those squares were split into quarters, with each family having their own quarter. So that's why you can see these little symbols are starting to fill up with 4 symbols in each square. So each family was assigned what's called a quarter section. And that's how they would begin to develop their land. Now, early census documents use this legal land description to locate the families. And this is what I love about the census. And these documents are all publicly available. We're looking at documents like this one is from 1926, but 1931 has been released. So you can see that if we were to go through the census, we could actually, and this is something that I am intending on embarking on with my sabbatical research, we can actually really specifically pinpoint where families not only began to live, but if they moved through the history of the census documentation. And right now we have the ability to do that until 1931 because those census data have been de-anonymized. Now, this image that you're seeing right now, this is the page of the census that shows my own family's census data from the 1926 census. So the top red square is just showing that legal land description that indicates in that block migration image that we saw just before. And then the larger square on the bottom shows the members of my family and exactly where they lived. So they were in, and I have it written on the side, the fourth meridian. So as we move from left to right, the pieces get bigger. So I'm going to move from right to left. They were in the fourth meridian, which is in Alberta, in the 12th range, the 53rd township, and the northwest corner of the 20th section. And the cool thing is that we can enter these legal land descriptions, these numbers, into online tools. This is Legal Land Converter, and get the exact coordinate on a map today. So we can see the red dot shows the original farm land of my family when they settled outside of Two Hills. So for anyone that is interested in genealogical research, these early census documents are really rich with detail that allow so many opportunities for genealogical research and GIS or mapping type research, which I find to be really, really exciting. Now, the census, as I mentioned earlier, the Canadian Census of Population has been collected since 1665. Now, obviously, there are no census documents about the prairie provinces from 1665. But the documents are there and available to be seen, though they are kind of spread out. And that's why on the other grant that I was talking about, data librarians are working towards creating a centralized portal for access. Now, between 1851 and 1951, the census became very formalized. Like those earlier census were not as formalized as the census that began in 1851. And these census were collected every 10 years. And then after 1956, every 5 years. Now, the interesting thing about that is that not all of the questions in this 5-year cycle, not all of the census questions are asked every 5 years. For example, the religion question, finding out what religion people are, that one is only asked every 10 years. So we have a very, very robust census every 10 years, and then like a pretty great census every 5 years. Now, after 92 years, these data become completely de-anonymized, and that's what's exciting for data librarians all over the country. This June, the 1931 census became available in Library and Archives Canada. So those census pages that you saw earlier in my presentation are available for view online. And Library and Archives Canada has done a lot of work with this particular census release to really make those documents accessible. And this is linked in the presentation. So when I share this particular presentation, you'll be able to navigate through some of these links. Now, the thing is that census geography now is not the same as census geography was in those earlier census. So we're no longer using those legal land descriptions, which is too bad because they're great. We're using this very seemingly complex hierarchy of census geography. But as it stands today, even if we did not have the ability to see those de-anonymized, so those individual person by person records, we still are able to look at a very small subset of data at the level of 400 to 700 people. So these are called this dissemination area, which is down there. So we can still see these very small blocks of the Ukrainian population, even though we don't have access to this individual level. But census data are available from the level of the province all the way down to these levels, these little kind of areas of 400 to 700 people. So despite not having this, this specificity, we still have a very good way to see where Ukrainians are living in Canada today. And for this presentation, after giving you that history, we'll be focusing on this period of the last 30 years of Ukrainian immigration. Now, how do we know that people are Ukrainian? They are asked in the census. So the way that the census used to work, which is very interesting, back in that historic document that you saw, was that a census taker would go around from community to community and ask people questions and then write those down. And part of the problem with that is that, as we know, there has been discrimination against all immigrants in Canada historically. So sometimes those data collectors did not exactly get things right. And that's something that can only really be discovered by looking at those historic documents. But since the kind of formalization of the census, and certainly in the past 30 years plus, these questions it's self-reported. So people are asked on the census to declare their ethnic origin. Now, this ethnic origin question itself has gone through so many significant changes. I mean, and what do we define as ethnic origin? How do we actually define that? And Statistics Canada has tried to really refine this question over the years, but I would be remiss to say that because they have kind of changed the way in which they ask the question, we need to be careful with the ways in which we interpret the results from this ethnic origin variable over time, just simply because the question that has been asked has changed. So in 1991, for example, this question, it just included 15 mark-in categories and 2 write-in boxes. And this mark-in category will become important when I talk about the 2021 census. This category was removed in 1996, so asking people to write in their ethnic origin in 4 boxes. So, people can respond with more than one ethnic origin. We will call this single and multiple origins. So people can claim heritage with multiple ethnicities, and those are counted in the census in a derived variable that makes up the ethnic origin results. But we can also access those data about the single origin, which is interesting for some people. But the important thing to know is that this question was accompanied by examples. So in 1996, census respondents were given 24 examples, which are listed here. And then they were able to, but they could write in whatever they want. And even if what their ethnicity was not counted in the example, they could still write that in. Between 2001 and 2006, the question remained the same. They did add two more examples. In 2011, due to the devastating decision by former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, the long form census was not a requirement like it has been since the beginning of the census in the 1850s. It's always been mandatory. But in 2011, Stephen Harper decided that that long form census should not be mandatory. So we have a little blip in 2011, and we need to be careful when doing any demographic research, and not just with ethnic origin, but with any question at all in census data. 2011 is always going to be, for all time, a little blip because the data are just not as reliable as they are in any other year in the history of census since the 1850s, which is very, very sad, but that's okay. In 2016, thankfully, the long form census was reinstated. So that is every 1 out of every 4 households in Canada gets the long form census. And they are really obliged and mandatorily to fill that out so that we have a reliable data set. Again, we have these 4 write-in boxes with examples. Now, 2021, the question was changed so significantly because they removed those examples and instead had a link to a list of over 500 examples. Now, why is this significant? We can see it in the data that the populations of many ethnic communities, I do research in the Portuguese ethnic community as well with a researcher at my university. The population seems to have dropped in 2021, but it is not because there was a drop in the population of ethnic communities, but because they changed the question. Statisticians at StatsCan found that the list was influencing the responses. So people were more likely to choose one of the ethnicities or ethnic origins from the list than they were to just come up with their own example. So that list that was given was kind of like a menu, and some people felt like they should select something from the list, which may have influenced in, I don't want to say negative, but influenced in an inconsistent way the actual numbers of the ethnic communities. So in 2021, that was removed. And this is why it is very, very, very important for us to use caution when we are comparing years and not get caught up in very specific numbers. Rather, when we're looking at ethnic origins, we're looking at trends, we're looking at frequencies, because as the question has changed, the results have changed. And that's not speaking to a reality, that's speaking to a statistical anomaly. So that's very, very important for us to know when using any data from the ethnic origin variable in the census. But, and this is something that I tell my students all the time as a data librarian, we must always read the notes, and we must always read the reference guides, of which Statistics Canada publishes profusely, to truly understand the variables that we are using in our research, because these changes, they're significant. I have a presentation linked here, which I will not go into now, which has more information about the history of the ethnic origin variable over time, and the changes to the definitions and stuff like that. So when I share the URL for this presentation with you, you can explore that variable in detail. So let's get to the data. I'm about to show you some charts and some maps that show the population of Ukrainians in Canada between 1991 and 2021. Again, the source data is all from the Census of Population, with the exception of the National Household Survey from 2011. The charts that I'm about to show are showing population at the level of the province, and they're showing both the counts and the ratios of Ukrainians to the rest of the population. Again, this is a bird's eye view of general trends. So really worrying about, tens, hundreds, or even thousands of people is not something that we can do. So while I have the numbers here, it's really not something that is necessary to worry about specific numbers necessarily. Instead, we want to focus on trends, again, because of those changes to that variable. Now you can see at the level of Canada that we have had a fairly stable population over the past 30 years of Canadians with a Ukrainian ethnic origin. Now we are seeing that drop in 2021, and that's something that we're going to see in all of the data from here on because of the change to that variable. And again, that drop does not mean that there was a significant exodus of Ukrainians from Canada, either due to emigration or life expectancy. It is really the result of the change to that question. But we can see the ratio, so that red line, the ratio of Ukrainian Canadians to the total population of Canada has really stayed within that 3% range over the past 30 years. So those ratios are what are bringing us back to data that is more reliable in that sense, without worrying too much about this drop off, which is just, again, an artifact of the change to the question. Now, I'm living in the Atlantic provinces now. I'm obviously from Edmonton. I came to Nova Scotia in 2017 for my job as a librarian at Mount St. Vincent University. So I'm part of this small, very small increase that you're seeing in Ukrainians in the Atlantic provinces. Now, a couple interesting things about the Atlantic provinces, specifically Cape Breton has a community of Ukrainians, and they have a Ukrainian Catholic Church in Sydney as well. But what I find so interesting is that despite the enthusiasm that Nova Scotians have for the Ukrainian community in Cape Breton, statistically, it's not that significant. It is anecdotally super significant. And most people that I meet that are from Nova Scotia, especially those from Cape Breton, are always very excited to tell me about the Ukrainian community in Cape Breton. And this is not to discount that community at all. I think it's amazing. But it's not statistically significant. And people are quite surprised when I tell them that, because I maybe Ukrainians, due to our nature and enthusiasm, we seem like we're more people than we actually are, just by our very presence in society. So I think it's great that Ukrainians have left such an indelible mark on Cape Breton. Now we do see the slight easing up to 2021, and this is what's so exciting about the census. And you can tell I'm a data librarian at heart, because the 2026 census is really going to show us the results of the CUAT program. Now, I know that the CUAT program, some folks are only in Canada temporarily, but I really think that some folks will stay, and that will be just so obvious in the 2026 census, in particular Newfoundland, because Newfoundland has had such a large amount of Ukrainians as a result of this program. So I am really interested to see what that looks like in the census for 2026. I mean, will we have this cultural community in Newfoundland of Ukrainians that will be kind of bucking the trend that I'm talking about here in this presentation? Well, when we look at Quebec, we see that the number and ratio in Quebec has been consistently low. So I lived in Quebec for a time, and so I'm definitely counted in this 2001 count. But as we can see, the ratio of Ukrainians in Quebec is quite low, much lower than the Atlantic provinces, and much, much lower than that 3% Canadian average that we saw. Though again, you can see this little blip that goes down over here as a result of the 2021 data. Ontario has a large population of Ukrainians, but they also have a large population. So the actual like average of Ukrainians, like the ratio of Ukrainian Canadians to Canadians is below 3%. Despite having very, very high numbers. And again, that's not to discount any cultural communities that exist in Canada. It's just compared to the prairie provinces, we're seeing this kind of like below the Canadian average. So the prairie provinces really bring that Canadian average of 3% up. And again, we see this decreased amount in 2021. Now, Manitoba, as a surprise to no one, has the highest ratio of Ukrainians in Canada over time. So that red line is just at the top. So we're looking at, 14 to 15% until the 2021 change. So despite having lower actual numbers compared to Ontario, we're seeing a very, very high ratio of Ukrainians in Manitoba. So 14 to 15% of the entire population of Manitoba claims a Ukrainian ethnic origin. Now, again, this is the multiple origin. So some of those ethnic origin, their people might have a Ukrainian and a Scottish ethnic origin or something like that. Those data are available, but not what I'm focused on here. So I'm looking at the total of anyone who has included Ukrainian as an ethnic origin in their census. But this is a phenomenal amount of Ukrainians in the province. And again, I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. Saskatchewan, again, remaining consistent at 13% of the population in Saskatchewan is Ukrainian. And then again, my home province of Alberta is lower at that range of 8 to 10%. So Alberta is showing the same raw population numbers as Ontario, which is really, really interesting to me. So despite Ontario being such a large province, Alberta actually has a similar number of Ukrainians living there as Ontario does. So again, very interesting numbers when we look at that from that kind of 30,000 yard view. We can see the composition of the country very, very clearly. British Columbia has a lower count and a ratio compared to the other Western provinces. But again, I also lived in British Columbia for a time. There is a lot of kind of interprovincial movement between BC and Alberta. So we do see that those ratios are between 4 to 5%. And but overall, the numbers are lower and even lower in those raw numbers of the actual count than Alberta. Despite the large population of British Columbia, as we know, BC and Ontario have the largest populations of, 4 provinces of just people in general. So we're seeing Alberta actually having super high amounts. Even though the ratio is not as high, the actual population is quite high in Alberta. Northern Territories is no surprise, but what is interesting is that it kind of is mirroring that national average. So where we're seeing these very, very low ratio averages in the Atlantic provinces and Quebec, we actually see statistically an average population compared to the whole federal average of Ukrainians in those Northern Territories. Which is quite interesting to me as well, because the population is really, really low generally in those Northern Territories. So when we're looking at population of Ukrainians, you can see it's in the 3,000s of people, but despite that, the ratio is mirroring that national average. Now, what we're going to look at next is some more granular data. So what we've been looking at until this point is data at the level of the province. So we're looking at those provincial statistics, which are very large. But as I said earlier, we have access in the census to really, really small units of analysis. So we're going to look today not at that smallest unit of analysis, but at something called a census division. Now, census divisions are very stable areas, stable over time. So that's what makes using a census division, which is smaller than a province, but larger than a municipality. So it's kind of this, it's still on the higher end, but they're very stable over time. So you'll see in longitudinal research, census research, that census divisions are used quite commonly because they haven't changed as much over time as some of those smaller units. Those smaller units, while compelling, really can change over time. So when we're looking at a population, say, of 400 to 700 people, a single condo development in a community will change that really small granular dissemination area unit that I was talking about. So that kind of analysis over time, it's possible, but those units need to be mapped onto each other so that the changes in the different kind of structures of the measurement need to be very carefully managed. So that's why we're going to look at census divisions right now, and then we will further look at something called a census subdivision. So what you are looking at here is a map that shows the ratio of Ukrainians in census divisions in the range of 1991 to 2021. So this first map that you're seeing here is a map of Canada in 1991, and the blue shaded areas are the areas in which people with a Ukrainian ethnic origin lived during that census period. You can see in this legend that we have the ratio percentages and the standard deviations. So the darker blue are ratios at the, like 4%, going down to the white, which is a very, very small ratio. So the kind of two upper levels of blue are where the most concentration are. Now, we will look at a little more granular view of this data, but you can see in 1991 that this parkland arch is very, very strong. So starting in Manitoba and going to Alberta, we still are seeing this settlement in this traditionally inhabited region. We're not seeing any blue as we know in Quebec or in the Atlantic region. There's small amounts of blue in the Northern Territories, but a strong, concentration of population in that arch region. As we go through the census data, here we have 1996. And the arch is still there. We can see that the ratio in the northern areas and in BC has increased a little bit, as well as in Ontario, but that darker blue arch is just still really, really prevalent. Here we are in 2001, and we're seeing that pattern again. And, I think it's no surprise that we will continue to see this pattern as the years go by. So where Ukrainians settled in the 1890s is where they're continuing to settle today, which is just so fascinating to me. So while with these maps, we're only looking at the past 30 years, we can see that trend has been happening for the past 100 years plus. And in my sabbatical research, I intend to create more maps like this that are much more granular. So here until 2021, we're seeing at that level of the census division. So that's bigger than a town, but smaller than a province. And you can see the borders of those there on the screen. It is very clear. The census subdivision is a subdivision of the census division. So it is used to describe municipalities or towns. In some places, the municipality, for example, I live in the Halifax regional municipality, which encompasses the cities of Halifax and Dartmouth, but also some of the smaller cities outside of the area. So we're not necessarily looking at cities specifically, but municipalities, which might encompass larger geographic regions. But again, we see, and I have really just zoomed in here on the prairie provinces, we see the same arch. Now, you can see very clearly that despite the grid formation that we saw earlier in the presentation with the Dominion Land Survey, that grid does not transfer in the same way to the census divisions and subdivisions. We see it a little bit in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, but certainly not in Alberta. So that's why some calculation on the back end needs to happen when we want to translate those data over time, because sometimes we will only have those legal land descriptions. But this shows very clearly the pockets of settlement of people with a Ukrainian ethnic origin in very specific areas of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. So again, this settlement in the Parkland region is very distinct. Now you can see the most clearly the results of that 2011 blip of the National Household Survey. So we're not seeing anything like we've seen with anything else. So we need to use caution with this particular map. But then again, in 2016, we're seeing the resurgence of this pattern. Now, we do not have the data for 2021 at the level of the census subdivision yet for the ethnic origin variable. So we are only seeing up to 2016, but those data will be released hopefully soon. And then I can continue my work on mapping at the level of the census subdivision. But it's just so compelling to see these historic communities and where people are located over time, over hundreds of years. So we can see again, 115 years, this pattern established in 1906 has really just persisted. And my sabbatical research will be to look at these census years going back to 1892. And I would like to create a more interactive map that can link to actual families and the locations of those families and where they lived and then where they moved. I mean, I think it's very common that people, and it certainly happened in my family historically, that they settled in Two Hills. And then, after a time, while they kept the farm, they moved into the city. So, my father was born in Bakerville, which is a bigger center outside of Two Hills. And then eventually the family moved to Edmonton. Now, we won't be able to know the accurate movement of individual families at this point past 1931. But as the years go by, we will be able to see where individuals actually moved and lived thanks to the de-anonymization of the census. So right now we can know kind of what happened in the 1930s, and it will be very exciting to see those subsequent census, because especially to see the impact, the specific impact of the internment, over time to the 1930s. So that will be like 15 years after the internment in 1930s. So I'm quite interested to look and see if that had any impact on maybe where people lived, if they, left their farms over a period of time, or if the family sizes decreased significantly. Like, all of these are questions that we can ask and answer thanks to these census documents. So that is what I have to say. I have a bibliography here, but I am now happy to take your questions and discuss any of this that you are interested in discussing. So hope this was enjoyable for you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. It was so informative, and thank you for the personal touch. It was fascinating to learn about the immigration patterns overall and also about your personal family story. I thought that was really special. I think there's so much to explore here. So to our audience, feel free to submit your questions into the Q&A chat box, or you can also raise your hand and we will unmute you and allow you to ask a question as well, if you wish.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I'm happy to reshare if we need to. It just makes it easier for me to see your face when you are asking a question. Oh,
Pan Roman has a question, and let's just, okay. Dr. Petrosian, you should be able to unmute yourself and go ahead with your question, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful presentation and so much substance to it that I'm sure, can talk for many hours. I wanted just to say to you and people listening that a couple of weeks ago we launched a film about Myrna Kostas, the Canadian author who has written about her books, and particularly in this film there is some scenes of her revisiting Two Hills, and she expressed in the question and answer period after the film premiered that she could hardly recognize Two Hills. Buildings are gone, and more importantly, the Ukrainians are gone, or many of them, and other kinds of settlers have come and are now working the land. So I just wanted to tell you that how important Two Hills is to the consciousness of the Ukrainian community, and to ask about the role of land, ownership of land. Does that arc persist because the land is being transferred from generation to generation?
I mean, that's a very good question that I don't have the answer to right now, and that would be difficult to answer without those de-anonymized census data, right? So I think, well, maybe not, but I think certainly in the case of my ancestors, they no longer own the land in Two Hills. And the last time that I was there, it was just kind of a dilapidated shack that was there on the land, and there's like a speedway right in the quarter section next to it, like a car racetrack. So I think I can really speak to the fact that the face of Two Hills has changed. Another part of what is happening, at least in those agricultural regions, is the concentration of land by single landowners. And that will change some of the census kind of information a little bit, because we'll see if one singular person owns several sections of land. If that person is Ukrainian, then yes, it'll show that there are Ukrainians there, but it's not necessarily going to show something so granular. Now, we do, when the census granular census data comes out, and when I have an opportunity to do more research, I will be able to look at that 400 to 700 person kind of concentration, which will be much more illuminating for seeing the actual populations of these very small communities. But I think that speaks to, you know, what happened with my family, certainly happened to many families with this move from the farm into the town, and then from the town into the city. And we've seen, you know, more opportunities for folks living in the cities, even in Edmonton, there were tons of opportunities for Ukrainian folks. So I think that I'll be able to hopefully answer that question in a small way with my research at the level of 400 to 700 people. But those de-anonymized census data, I think, I'm so sorry about my cat. She's very interested in Ukrainians. I think that is a very interesting question. So I will write that down and add that to my list of things that I need to answer for you, Roman, because you're asking me very good questions that will help with my sabbatical research. I can't thank you enough. I really mean that.
Thank you for this one. And then we have another question from the audience. Does the census include information about the educational backgrounds from the home country, from Ukraine, and also occupational experiences of migrants here in Canada? Or has any research been done on that?
So the census data do include, these historic census data include the occupation, which it will be no surprise, the occupation is farmer. I'm going to go click on that and see if I can bring up the full sheet. But it is not covering, at least these historic census are not covering education. So if you give me 1 second, I will see if I can find, of course, LAC has changed the link. But we don't have information about education from the home country. We have information about the composition of the family, and again, where they lived. Religion was a question that was there, but certainly not education. Now, subsequent census, and certainly the census that we have today, does have information about education and income and all of these things. But we're not seeing that in these historic documents. And I am not finding on LAC because they've changed the link, this document. So it will just take me a second to pull it up so that you can see it for yourself. But yeah, the census is really only capturing kind of Canadian information, unfortunately. But we do have information, current information about educational attainment, income, generation status. So many more questions are asked on the census now, like it's unreal. It's really something.
Thank you, Sandra, for letting us know about this fact. And I was also wondering if you could perhaps identify some of the major areas in census data research that require more attention, the areas that need to be studied more in the future. I have a lot of students and researchers in the audience, so perhaps it could inspire someone.
Well, I mean, what's really coming out of and this is speaking more to the grant project that I'm working on, is the ways in which people are named and the ways in which not only ethnic communities are named, but also like Indigenous communities and, gender is another thing that is a kind of a newer topic in the census as well. So preliminary research is being done now on how people were named and counted. And as I alluded to earlier, some of these earlier census documents may not, even though they exist and they are here, they may not be totally accurate because of these historical biases of the census takers. So that is everything from the spelling of people's names to their religions to the names of their home communities. Their home communities, like where their ethnic origin is. So we're now seeing that we maybe don't have the type of information historically that we thought we had, especially when it comes to those marginalized and racialized communities. So there is a large opportunity for people that are interested in the census to begin looking historically at the nature of representation in different ethnic origin communities, different traditionally racialized or marginalized community, to understand how these people were counted and represented. Because we may need to do more than census research to truly understand these communities based on the, biases that the people had who were government agents. I can think of specifically in Alberta, there were historically Black communities that not a lot of people are aware of. So further research on some of these communities that have been marginalized, I think, would be really interesting and needed. Some colleagues of mine at Queen's and Toronto Metropolitan, formerly Ryerson University, are looking at just that, how the names of Indigenous communities and the ways in which Indigenous people were represented in the census has changed over time. So some people weren't counted on purpose. And we know that there was a lot of discrimination against Ukrainian communities early on in the history of Alberta, being part of this community, but there are other communities who have faced that similarly. So I think that's a big area now that we can begin to understand, that goes kind of beyond the census, but takes into account some of that colonial history of discrimination and marginalization in Canada.
Thank you, Sandra, for this extremely astute answer. Does anyone have any other questions today? Well, thank you once again, Sandra, for this fascinating presentation and for your research, which is just extremely insightful. I feel like 1 hour passed within a blip, within 1 second. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today. And please stay tuned for our next lectures and more events in the future. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.